In this next section, we're going to be talking about databases. Now, in this series, up until this point, we've looked at several mechanisms for storing data from one page reload to another. What this allows for is a rich interaction between the user of your web application and the application itself. In our latest examples, we looked at using sessions to store this data. But the problem with sessions is that they're browser-specific, for one, which means that if the user opens up a different browser or uses a different computer, then their information won't be available to them. Also, there are some limitations with how we can use that session data, which we can overcome by using a database instead. Now we get three big things by storing information in a database instead of using some other mechanism. The first is that the data isn't tied to a particular browsing session. That means it can be accessible today, but also accessible in a year from a different computer and a different browser. The second is that there are a lot of tools that we can use to work with information in a database. There's a huge number of programs out there that will allow us to browse information in a database, to update records in a database, and to delete information out of it. Whereas if we were working with session variables, for example, we'd have to build all of those tools ourselves. And finally, databases come with a language that you can use in order to create complex filters and searching tools to find the exact records that you want. We can look at some of the examples that we've worked with in this series to get a sense of how databases could benefit us. So for example, in one of our scenarios, we had a list of users with information associated with them, like their shoe size and their birthday. And one of the ways that we worked with this information was through a comma-separated value list of this information. Now we only had 3 or 4 users in that list, but imagine if that list grew to 1,000 people, and we wanted to correct one of the users. We had their shoe size wrong, for example. So if you imagine assigning this task to somebody, there's a lot of room for error. For example, what happens if they accidentally remove a comma from one of the other records, or accidentally delete a couple of records because they highlighted the wrong text? Well, if we were working with a database, we could isolate the editing process to just a single record instead of opening up the entire data set, which could be pretty important to keep intact. Also, what happens if we want to search that database of people? If it's in a comma-separated value file, we have to create a parser to pull all of that information out into an array and create a loop to loop through that array and find matching information. And when we're dealing with a large amount of information like that, it's going to hit the server pretty hard because we're going to be taking up all of this memory with all of these records. So a database makes that actually really easy, and it opens up a lot of mechanisms for us to search and filter that are really easy to use and don't require any custom coding. In another one of our examples, we created a random text generator where the user could supply a story with all of these placeholders, and then also a list of placeholders to randomly insert into that story. So it worked kind of like Mad Libs. Now imagine we want users to be able to share those with one another. Well, we can use a database in order to store that information and make it shareable, and we can build a whole site around this ability to be able to share random text generators. That's going to be a whole lot easier to do with a database. One more example where a database might come in handy is our user login form example. When the user submitted their username and password, it checked them against an array of information, and if a match was found, they would be let into the site. But now, what if we want the user to be able to set their own password? Well, we have to store that password in a way that's accessible to the user, but in a way that doesn't open up the ability to adjust all of the passwords to that user. So these are just a few scenarios where a database might come in handy. This chapter of videos is going to be very empowering. We'll explore how to browse an existing database, we'll create our own database and our own database tables where we're going to store information, and then we're going to build scripts to be able to manipulate this information, to add information to a database, to remove it from it, and to allow updating of individual records.